So here we're going to get into the basic organization of the nervous system and introduce the general concepts and terms that will be used throughout the rest of the lectures. So I always like to keep in mind the big picture of the function of the nervous system. And despite what nerdy philosophers may tell you, it's not really about thinking, but it's about movement. So here I want to look at some simpler system to once again ground the idea in biology. So only organisms that move need a nervous system. This simple hydra here, for example, with a very primitive nervous system, such as this nerve net, can respond with movement to stimulation, although in a relatively unsophisticated fashion. However, with the advent of bilateral symmetry and cephalization, that is the evolution of a head, a nervous system co-evolves to allow directed forward movement. And for this more complex type of movement, the organism needs coordination of movement throughout the whole body. And this requires some sort of central processing unit which will allow that coordination. So here we see that centralized, internally localized neurons called the ganglia in the head region and central neurons going down the length of the body. They're receiving input from the periphery, and that information is integrated to allow a coordinated response of the whole organism by controlling that peripheral motor output, that is, the movement of the body. So this is the basic plan of a centralized nervous system, that is, taking in information from the environment and kind of building a picture of that world somehow in at least some kind of rudimentary form here, which is going to allow the organisms to move around that world in a purposeful manner. So the human nervous system, while massively more complex, carries out the same basic functions. That is, it's picking up information from the environment in different ways, internalizing it, and kind of builds a picture of the world by integrating sensory and stored information, and eventually will respond to that information in some way. So movement is really the ultimate goal here, because why do all that if you're not going to do anything with that information? So when trying to make sense of the organization of the nervous system, it can be helpful to make these flowcharts to help you understand it. But I find it helpful to think of it in terms of flow of information. So what do we mean by these flowcharts? These can be drawn in several different ways, and you can make whatever kind of chart makes sense to you and helps you understand the nervous system. So this one here has nice cartoon pictures, which I like, and it breaks down the nervous system to these two main divisions, the central and peripheral nervous system, and then breaks down the peripheral nervous system into the sensory and motor, and then further breaks down the motor division into somatic and autonomic, and then further breaks down the autonomic nervous system, etc., etc. But even though I like pictures, and I'll use this occasionally, I don't particularly like the way the sensory and motor divisions seem confined to the peripheral nervous system. I prefer this chart right here, because the way I like to think of the nervous system is in terms of flow of information. Because really these sensory and motor pathways are anatomically and functionally separate throughout both the peripheral and the central nervous system. And remembering those long axons of neurons, we'll see that individual neurons can span both systems, that is, be partly in the central nervous system and partly in the peripheral nervous system. Charts aside, you always want to relate this to the actual anatomy of the nervous system. And the main divisions are going to center around the brain and spinal cord on the one hand, and the nerves on the other hand. Anatomically speaking, the brain and spinal cord are very simply the part of the nervous system located within the skull and the vertebral column. The general function is to somehow make sense of information based on input coming in from the peripheral nerves, integrate that information, and really to build a picture of the external world. And once the brain has built a picture of the world that it's operating in, it can then formulate an appropriate coordinated motor response. The central nervous system is also monitoring the internal state of the body to maintain homeostasis. And then there's all those higher level functions, which we'll talk about next lecture. So notice those terms that are associated with the central nervous systems, in particular nuclei and tracts. For these lectures, whenever you hear the term nuclei, you should be thinking of that as clusters of cell bodies rather than the organelles within a cell. The nuclei refer to distinct clusters of neurons with common functions, whereas a center refers to cortical regions of neurons carrying out a common function. We'll talk more about that in Lecture 14. And in Lecture 15, we'll encounter nuclei when looking at spinal cord sections like this, and we'll also see tracks running up and down the spinal cord within the white matter. So that's it for the central nervous system from now. Let's take a look at the peripheral nervous system. Anatomically, it is very simply that part of the nervous system that is outside the skull and vertebral column. This largely consists of nerves, that is cranial and spinal nerves, which deal with the outside world directly, either by carrying information gathered from all the various receptors of the body into the central nervous system, or carrying messages out of the central nervous system to innervate muscles and glands. So more on that on Lecture 15, but there's also those clusters of neuron cell bodies outside the skull and vertebral column. These are referred to as ganglia, and we'll frequently refer to the dorsal root ganglia, which are the cell bodies of the sensory neurons sitting right outside the spinal cord. So these are the kind of terms I'll be using very commonly, and I'm going to assume that you know what I'm talking about. So it's important not to get left behind on that. It's also easier to remember them in paired terms, like how the words center and nuclei are related, as well as tracks and columns are related. And then there's those terms that have similar definitions, but they're named differently depending on whether they're in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about these sensory and motor pathways.